this episode is Epiphanis, and Epiphany, of course, transliterates as a manifestation of God.
So, those of you looking to destroy this government are programmed to do so by the Russians because this government provided, in spite of its history of atrocity and genocide, what stability you have in the current environment. Because you've opted to feel it as your enemy. You've turned to Russia as the master race to save you from your American federal enemy, and the end result has been the division of our population, with the Republicans following Antichrist and any independent thinker not believing, if they have any modicum of common sense, the overwhelming majority of crap you find in alternative media. So all of Aquino's servants that alternative media promotes and markets has to be recognized as your enemy under occupation. Even if Donald Trump does not survive his term, either physically or politically, the die has been cast. The war is on. It will not end until regime change in Russia. Because Moscow is the source of all your ills in politics on earth. And you cannot see it because your brain has been so pickled, so atrophied, that you cannot even understand what Douglas Dietrich has been exposing in his generational impact across several generations. I have impacted the United States via my exposition of human trafficking rings, of Satanism, and all of this has leaked into the body politic. And what have they done with it? They have surrendered to Michael Aquino. They've surrendered to the enemy I exposed because he countered with his psyops by taking advantage of everyone's revulsion and shock at the satanic scandals of the 1980s and turned them into a funhouse mirror, distort it so that people imposed everything done by his military junta onto the Democratic Party and the primary candidates like Hillary Rodham Clinton through his programs like QAnon and his psyops out of St. Petersburg in Scotland, through Cambridge Analytica in England, leading to Brexit and the people screaming, "Lock her up," and the installation of the Antichrist puppet Donald Trump in the office of Executive Commander-in-Chief, in reality obeying his own Lord and Master, his puppet master, Michael Aquino, at all times. So too Vladimir Putin via his handler, Alexander Dugin, surname spelled D-U-G-N, proudly introduced by his propaganda asset in the United States, Alex Jones, as Putin's brain. All of you now in the age of Antichrist live online with no theological sense of discernment or practical common sense. So the real generals on the ground, in the battlefield for the mass mind, be yourselves. And as armchair generals, you have all, as Picasso stated, fallen victim to your academic arts, whereas armchair generals, you cannot understand the practical experiences of a master combatant manifest as Douglas Dietrich. Adolf Hitler's biological son. You go into denial. You reject all I say, as the Western Church rejected the kings of the East who came to baptize their God, because it was my civilization, China, that was Christian long before there was a Christianity. Now explain the reality of this. Over the years, and now that your own reality is at a crisis point, the most important, critical catastrophe in human history is upon us. A convergence of natural disaster, solar systemic warming, with industrial exacerbation, turning a cyclical event into an extinction event. And at this juncture in human history, do the worst of the worst come to power the world over. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, Trump in America, Orban in Hungary, formerly as a nation state, the sword and buckler of Europe itself against the invasion of the Turks. Now a gateway for motherfucking Russia and the resatellization of the Warsaw Pact nations behind the Iron Curtain, that it may fall yet again. Over this time, not just Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, via England and Norway and North America, the entire developed world now falls before the latter-day godless Mongols of post-Soviet Russia. And similar to the French, undergoing Vichy and division into civil war, our current experience, like theirs, of the French people in World War II. This parallel experience, so dehumanizing and overwhelming, an experience that turns an entire human being with a complicated life history and destiny first into a cipher and then into a fatality. At the very least, a casualty, a damaged, walking wounded. It's that entity that Saint Exupéry wanted to rescue in the person, not the statistic, not the abstract, not the concept, not the demographic, but the population. So the statistics could be any of those the men on the planet are obsessed with, within the context of the narrative of Le Petit Prince, where when he visits other planetoids, there are men he encounters on these other planetoids that have their obsessions, their monofocal fixations, which fester their entire essence of being, their entire manifest behavior, their inability to live, but only instead focus on some kind of fetish, the counting fetish, that might take in stars if one be an astronomer, or profits for the businessmen. All of these become archetypes on the planetoids of Le Petit Prince, where the little prince visits an astronomer who is counting all the stars, visits a businessman who is accruing all the profits. All the acquisitions in the universe never be enough. The astronomer will never reach the end of his count. All related with the special intensity and poignance of the narrative of a Petit Prince, the story in which Saint-Exupéry dramatizes the struggle against abstraction, not as a philosophical subject, but as a life and death story. All of you, if confronted, would comport yourselves with the facade, the mask of a persona that stands up for the child. You would say, oh, we want to shatter forever the paedopathocracy. We want to destroy human child trafficking. We want these people brought to justice. And the most insane and deluded among you will attribute that to Donald Trump, that he would break the child trafficking rings, which you have projected onto the Democratic Party, and particularly in the person of Hillary Rodham Clinton, the matriarch archetype, because of QAnon, because of acquisitions, gets Comet Ping Pong Pizza Parlor. All of you culminate in the projection onto the other of what your side represents, the Republicans, that dominates alternative media and promotes the inversion, the perversion of all reality on its head, to where you're fucking a man in the ass and you think you've got him in the mouth. All of you assholes are out there saying, I want to stand up for the children. You speak constantly of pedo-porn, pederast pornography on the dark web and the deep web. Not a single motherfucking one of you useless pieces of shit have ever done a thing in your life about it. Everyone complains about the weather, but nobody changes it. But here among you, Douglas Dietrich has destroyed operative rings of child trafficking, shut down the most important military base outside of the Pentagon, El Presidio Real de San Francisco, because of what they were doing to the children, shut down the Marine Corps pedo-pornographic ring. And in reward, I've been assigned gang stalkers that harangue, harass myself and my loved ones for the rest of my existence. And when one fails, they insert another. Where Richard K. Cole fails, they insert Niall Parkinson. Out of Ireland, operating out of all things, out of Ireland, directed out of Scotland by Michael Aquino. A man with his own graphic art studio. With the temerity, while I'm transmitting, to harangue my executive producer and attempt to hire him away from myself, from whom he gets no pay, to bribe him into service of his dark design, the very name of his art studio. Oh, so telling. They don't even hide it. Just like my former cultic gang stalker, who died in his attempts to take me down, physically and reputationally. Master Sergeant Green Beret John Vigilillier has his sights still up. This ain't hell, but you can see it from here, because of his service to the Antichrist and his desire to damn all your souls to the eternal flames of torment, which he now suffers in the first person. And all you people buy the shit these people eat up on my own timeline. On Facebook, we had this human piece of shit, this faggot, Niall Parkinson, produce promotions on my timeline for Peter Levinda, the author of the Simon Necronomicon. And, of course, Michael Aquino's own favorite, Richard Dolan, known as Disfo Dick, A man whose wife divorced him on the basis of his obeying Michael Aquino to attack myself. That was indeed among the many factors that she severed from him to protect the safety of her own daughters from him once I exposed to her that he was a servant of Michael Aquino. And she realized her daughters were in the house of a pedo-Satanist. Then she divorced Richard Dolan. And yet all of you worship Richard Dolan as the master of the secret space program. All of you buy the Avon edition of the mass market pocket paperback Necronomicon authored by Peter Levinda under the pseudonym of Simon, the Simonomicon. All of you out there who listen to me on alternative media obey these other apostatals, apostate apostles of Antichrist, thinking you can pick and choose and build together like a set of Lego blocks, self-assemble your own decided paradigm. That's not how it works. You cannot take components from an airplane and a train and an automobile and create yourself a submarine. And if you did that and took it to the sea, you would sink below its depths, your lungs filled with salt water, wondering where it all went wrong. And that's where your composited paradigms take you, to the bottom of the sea, to the abyss, to the nullification of your very soul as desired by the anti-gods. And yet I, the only man on record who has shut down entire operations, entire operative rings of your military junta in child trafficking, I'm not honored as a national hero. Instead, I'm suppressed and censored by the mere absence of my name from any discussion of history, criminology, military, or foreign affairs, because of the reality I represent being too bright a light for your hearts in darkness. The overwhelming majority of you can't even comprehend the complexity of the narrative which I expose. So you try in your denial to attack the details, and though you ever and always fail, you continue because you seek the darkness, you seek the death, you seek the nullification of your soul because you feel that that's the only way you'll ever have your peace. And it's in that light, that environment of autodestructive despair, that Saint Yezidari moves the narrative of the Little Prince from asteroid, from planetoid to desert, from fable and comedy to enigmatic tragedy, in order to make one recurrent point. You cannot love roses. You can only but ever love a single rose. You cannot have many masters. You cannot pick and choose from the servants of Satan and the apostatals of the anti-gods, and then say, but I can take some of what I like to hear from Douglas Dietrich and place it together with that I enjoy from Stephen Quayle. Stephen Quayle is a cultist of the Temple of Set, as is all of your alternative media sources, or they would not be before you, made ever available, given guest slots on Coast to Coast AM. The only reason I was guessed it was because I held the satanic codes. They brought me on as they brought on James Casbolt / Michael Prince because they thought me to be an active Aquino acolyte. Only when that was exposed by Aquino himself in his rage and his surprise that I had been on multiple times, as not the case, did they never dare mention my name again. And yet you go among these hedges of blossoms raised in the fertilizer of Satanistic shit to try and combine, crossbreed, transplant those blooms with myself, the last in a line from the sons of Seth, the righteous third son of Adam. The sons of Seth being the original Schutzstaffel or SS, after which Hitler named the modern, weaponized, uniformed vanguard of the 18th century Bavarian Illuminati when he himself became illuminated. So, when I blossom here before you, I can explain to you, at this stage in my life and maturity, the meaning of Le Petit Prince for all of the Prince's journey, the Star Child, as seen by Saint Exupéry in his moment of death, laughing delightedly, not at him, but for him, because he was guiding towards him the camel-riding Bedouin who would bring him back among us to write this very book, as was writ the Revelation of the Magi by the 12 kings out of China. All that journey of his literary Star Child, Le Petit Prince, within his narrative, that journey be a journey of exile, as I am exiled from my true homeland and heartland, forever away, because that child of my mind, the Dietrich Adolph, hates myself with a passion. So I'd be stranded amongst the white savages of North America, away from my own. I too, like that child in Le Petit Prince, the Star Child himself, am experiencing that journey in exile, and only now can I finally understand the meaning of that deceptively simplistic novel, a novella. And all of you are experiencing that same exile under occupation that the French population did in Vichy. Because, like Saint Exupéry's own experience, as mirrored and reflected by the Little Prince, his journey from planetoid to planetoid before he reaches planet Earth, his journey of exile be away from generic experience towards the eroticism of the particular flower, to be responsible for his rose. The prince learns is to see it as it really is, in all its fragility and vanity, indeed in all its utter commonness, without loving it less for being thus so. So in my own banality, in my own humanity, where I've had men like the Satanist James Arthur Yanchik, the great friend and defender of pedophiles, who brings them into his neighborhood, ankle bracelets and all, to become the champion for them against all his normal neighbors. He decried myself as, to quote he, James Arthur Yanchik, a known user of prostitutes. Well, we can't all be predators on children. We can't all be someone who defends such predators like James Arthur Yanchik and triumphs them. Instead, some of us are merely human and do what we can to satisfy our needs in the moment, without judgment. We can't alleviate ourselves by sublimation and abstraction. We're too human in our vicarious experience of the embodiment that we're in, this mortal coil, to deny ourselves what pleasures it can provide. We can't all be James Arthur Yanchik, who declares himself a straight heterosexual male who just happens to pick up the chick drop-off from Michael Aquino. His girlfriend, Lucinda, of course, having told me personally that her skin was scrubbed off with a scouring pad by Michael Aquino in a bathtub. And yet, James Arthur Yanchik would never allow her to come on to my broadcasts, my transmissions, to speak of this atrocity. Because he told her, you're nothing but a whore. Just a punk bitch. While Michael Aquino is a great man, a war hero, an authority figure in uniform. You can't harass him. He served the Republic. He serves the nation. So when I've exposed what I have, it hasn't been in your simple-minded, anti-federalist, anti-governmental perspective. What I've exposed is those elements which have been running your federal government to the ground, the military junta, as the villains, the pedopathocracy that has corrupted the politicians. All of the politicians corrupted, in the overwhelming sense, have been Republican. You have Democrats like Ted Kennedy. You have other examples, of course, to be sure. But it's the Republicans who, en masse, became the insurgent front of the ultimate Antichrist empire. Motherfucking Russia, Gog out of the Bible, that you so-called evangelical Christians here in North America have sided with. And on this Epiphany date, I am here to condemn you. I'm here to condemn you and all the other sources you seek in alternative media as the acolytes of Aquino. And you find that presumptive. You find that arrogant. There's no hubris there. That's because I'm not a researcher. I'm not a propagandist. I am a public informant, an experiencer who brings you the truth, the facts, the reality. And as in that novella, that may have been one of the factors, indeed, almost certainly was, in the narrative of my latent sainted Cyrus's, my wonderful mother's personal experience of life, that which inspired her to go into multilingualism, that same narrative of Le Petit Prince, that therefore is one of the elements responsible for my delivery into this world. It's within that narrative we see the persistent triumph of a specific experience, which can be found in something as idiosyncratic and bizarre as the opening image of the narrative of our little prince in that little novella of a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant, which the narrator relates unto us the grown-ups can only see as a generic object. When it's drawn out by the little prince into a sketch, it looks as unto a hat, as opposed to what the boy sees in his mind's eye. As the Bedouin was the only man who could see in the space between his ears the star child which led him unto St. Yezebeli, dying in the desert, within an inch of total dehydration, to ultimately relate that narrative unto us. This be where St. Yezebeli and the Surrealists who so admired him, via a tracing of his hand in one of the issues of the Surrealist journal Minotaur. This is what they touch upon, and I saw a copy of that journal via the online cooperation program, OCLC, that I was abusing when I wasn't abusing it for a keynote. I was able to exploit for myself. So when the Surrealists touch in their journal Minotaur upon this tracing of St. Yezebeli's hand, as now almost their version of a kind of Christ imprintation on his shroud of death, as the Christ face and features appear upon his shroud that has been so venerated by Christians through the ages. St. Yezebeli's hand trace has become almost like a subcultural abstraction. Then it's through that insight that I saw René Magritte's paintings, the great surrealist who drew us castles in the sky, the floating fortress, literally a grand rock of Gibraltar in the air with a castle atop it. That's Magritte. The false prophets. And comfort yourselves with their lies and deceptions. And of course, much of it comes down to appearances. I've actually had people enter onto YouTube that if Douglas Dietrich didn't look so different, his message would resonate so much the more. Well, we can't all be overweight, balding white guys. So when I appear before you, getting younger as I do in appearances, thanks to professional photography, professional cosmetic application by my medical cosmetologist, V. Clark, herself a burn victim, who learned to rehabilitate her own image, restructure it, recreate herself. Because my features have not been damaged so thoroughly, I don't have any scarification to challenge such a professional. There's all that factors into my looking younger. This brings us back to the dedication of this transmission to Madame Cotier. There's a fact that I was touching upon in my hungover state when I was originally answering her question and brought up the subject of vampirism, which I hadn't addressed in years. The other factor, of course, is being true to myself, to my mortal coil, to my physical embodiment, to the physiology of what I am. During the period of time that I was providing care to both my late and sainted parents, 24-hour-a-day care as deemed necessary by the state of California itself. During that period of time, I had very little opportunity to satisfy myself sexually or to release any sexual tensions. Were it not for pornography, I would have died. But every once in a while, what few encounters I could have with escorts or prostitutes were quick and dirty, done with within minutes, because of my need to be constantly on the watch for my parents' well-being. Once they were dead, the both of them, and I was able to reemerge in my own right to satisfy my own needs as a survivor, as a human being, and something a little above, a little beyond, and something a little less. Then, too, did I finally have the opportunity, through loved ones, like my former, most intimate professional escort, who after her sexual affirmation surgery, which she had been seeking all her life, became my adoptive son. Through the drinking again of his blood, now that he was male, and the blood of others who have been volunteers, that too has really helped me reverse the aging process. It wouldn't work for you as a baseline human. You wouldn't have the physiology to digest the blood. But I do, because of my mother's bloodline. As a Damphier, a half human, half vampire, and in my turn, as someone a quarter-blooded so. So it was this other physiological factor that I was addressing when queried about my appearance by Caroline Gautier, and now I return to educating you about that physiological evolution that ultimately produced such as myself. The true vampires being far different from what I am, hybridized as I am, down to probably the most diluted form of this subspeciation of humanity. The question now should be asked, most commonsensically, why did this subspecies develop? How did it develop? And this is what confronted the Soviets, who were the only empire to have done in-depth research of the most invasive kind into the subspeciation of humanity known as Homo nocturnus, or night man. And in their exploitation of this subgenus, twas the Soviet Union that, based on its own atheistic, materialist, rationalist paradigm, interpreted the source of human subspeciation known as vampirism to the day after the progenitors of mankind lost our battle for the planet of the apes, to a time when, as the Soviets, stark believers in primate evolution, felt that we all evolved from primatoid species. They felt that after the true, more primal embodiment, the original model of primate, won out in the struggle for evolution, and humanity, or what was to become humanity, lost. That was the source of subspeciation known as vampirism in the ages to follow. So the Soviet Union, unlike their medieval ancestors under the Tsar, no longer looked for Eden to the east in Asia, where it truly is, and as I've identified it as such within the narrative carried unto me by my own latent sated matron, my Cyrus Diana Dietrich, being just south of the Caucasus Mountains that divide Europe from Asia, from whence we source our very term for the white race, Caucasian. Beneath that is Asia, from whence derives the term Asia, south of the Caucasus Mountains. In that primordial Eden did Adam develop his agrarian revolution in wake of the biblical flood as overwhelmed the Black Sea. All geophysical, historical facts which I've exposed in my narrative I inherited from my latent sated Cyrus, a scion of that ancient bloodline going back to Adam's third son, the patriarch Seth, the original SS, the sons of Seth, from whence Adolf Hitler took his inspiration for the Schutzstaffel, the security service, when they were revolutionarily modernized out of the Bavarian Illuminati. That is Eden on physical Earth, where now flourishes the regional Azeri capital of Iran, Tabriz. Unlike the reality as outlined in your Bible, through the deceptions of false prophets, most of you have come to think of your primeval home as lying on the African savanna. And because the Soviets exhorted this deception, they too set the source for divergence between man and vampire lay on the African savanna, incepting some 20 million years agone, at a time when the world was originally enjoying the Miocene in former Deutschen or German Ostafrika, what became the very horn in which I served so many of my mercenary contracts, Kenya, East Africa, where your president, prior to your puppet installation of a Russian asset, where your last true president was born, foreign born he may have been, far more a real executive he truly was that place called Kenya, where 20 million years ago it was cooler and very well watered, where today there'll be savanna, then there were forests, and in those forests were primates in a primordial arboreum, or treetop land of the apes. Somehow, sometime, somewhere in the bush, a savanna-ranging she-ape gave birth to a monster. He may have looked much like his fellows on the outside, but beneath it all he had a literal taste. Not for fruits, not for vegetables, not for meats, but for blood. And it was that taste, and no other, which made him appear to those he fed off as the first enemy, the scientific counterpoint to Cain, the vampire. The vampire's tool use never developed beyond the utilitarian need to tap the human vein. He hunted his prey via the adaptation of endogenous biochemicals to infuse into the bloodstreams of his victims and thereby mythify the very existence of his kind. Via the ecstasy they felt as females, or the ecstatic religious experiences male victims would feel in their sleep when he fed upon them. Because men get attacked in their sleep, but women are fed upon while they're conscious. And yet, despite the literally imposing mismnemonic abilities that evolution has gifted the vampire subspecies with, what be in essence a non-lethal biochemical weapon with which to throw off effective acknowledgement, let alone pursuit of their human prey throughout the millions of years of our mutual coexistence as an honest species of laborers as viewed by the Soviet Union under their Marxist ideology, and a predatory subspecies of parasites as reviled by the Soviet Union as an enemy to replace the Jew, since most Bolsheviks of the Russian Revolution were Jewish exiles, Jewish academics, the Jewish intelligentsia that had returned to Russia to become the Commissarocracy with machine guns. The Judeo-Bolshevik ideology of Soviet Russia demanded a replacement of the Jews that existed in Europe for the Reich. So instead of the Jew, the Soviets began to hunt out their concept of a social parasite, the physical parasitism of vampirism. Because vampires are the very epitome of physicality. For force of logic, they must be so to remain so utterly enslaved to their hematophagous needs, their blood feeding. And towards that end, the Soviets developed something that was decried in the West as a kind of collateral technical phenomenon with no applicability discernible to engineers. The vampire detection technology known as Kirlian photography. Now, much was in the rage about photographing auras in the West back in the 60s and the 70s. Based on Kirlian photography. Now, being a contact print process, Kirlian corona discharge photography requires no camera or lens. However, when a transparent electrode is substituted for the discharge plate, it'd be possible to use a standard camera with a bulb setting or video camera. This potential for portability proved indispensable in the identification of vampires by agents of the Soviet state. You see, as I've outlined before about vampirism when I spoke of it, when I first came out as a public informant, and that's all anyone wanted to hear about, all the kids want to hear about vampires and zombies. If I hadn't addressed that, you never would have heard of me at all. Vampires don't sweat. Like pigs, another mammal, which cannot be maintained in the desert. The reason that the Hebrews and all other Semites, the people of the desert, the tribes that wandered the burning sands, both those of Jewish and Muslim faith, the original Semitic peoples throughout North Africa, Southwest Asia, into Central Asia, all of these peoples think the pig is dirty. You cannot keep the pig if you're a Jew or a Muslim. To the Jew or the Muslim, pork is poison. This has to do with a sense of populist solidarity. A pig cannot sweat, therefore, in the desert it will die. The only way to maintain a pig in the desert is by constantly hosing it down with water. If you want to raise a pig to the point where it can provide enough food to make it worthwhile, you're going to be using a lot of water in the desert that's not readily available. In the days before plumbing, before aqueducts, before you had the transport of water for agriculture, you had people walking with buckets for miles. Who would want to waste that by dumping it on a pig just so some person could ultimately enjoy the taste of bacon? Well, the wealthy sheikhs of the desert did, and people died to keep their pigs alive, died of thirst, or died of transporting precious water for their precious pork. So the Jews eliminated this immediately by their patriarchs saying, the pig is poison. Don't eat of the pig. We can't afford to maintain the processing of pork in our wanderings through the desert. With the Muslims and the advent of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said no more water will be wasted on keeping pigs alive when there's people that need to eat and could readily eat anything else. So the pork is poison in the desert to the Muslim and the Jew. There's no point in wasting water on the maintenance of a mammal that requires water needed for everyone and anything else. Because otherwise, it would die without eating up everyone else's supply, for plant or man. Vampires, too, are unheard of in the desert cultures. Neither Jews nor Muslims speak of vampire encounters. Rather, the subspeciation of humanity that feeds off the dead be the ghul, which goes after the meat, the carrion, the rotting carcass, not the living blood. But where they thrive, where there's plenty of water, the temperate zones, you find the legend of the vampire. But how do you find that which casts no reflection, that which casts no shadow? Since vampires do, they appear as normal people. It wasn't until the advent of the Soviet Union and an Armenian buffoon, a putterer, suddenly becomes declared the hero of the Soviet Union because he finally made mobile the technology that could render vampire visible to human beings. There be no aura, because a vampire doesn't sweat. And as a result, they were all finally identified, interned into a concentration camp in Novaya Zemlya, north of the Polar Circle, and annihilated in a detonation of the largest nuclear weapon ever blown in human history, the Tsar Bomba, the king of all bombs, that annihilated any evidence there ever existed as a species of humanity in Eurasia. So the genocidal Soviets, the communists, are hated by those that would live with this subspecies, that their physiology might someday be used to benefit mankind. The progressives who were willing to co-speciate, to coexist with this subspecies of Homo sapiens sapiens, Homo nocturnus, were Emperor Hirohito and Adolf Hitler. And that's why my mother's father, an ethnic Chinese vampire, was allowed to take on the marriage of Japanese nobility in the capital of empire, Tokyo itself, giving birth to my late and sainted siress Diana Dietrich, scion of the Kyushu dynasty and the sons of Set, and ultimately, through her affair with Adolf Hitler, my birth into your world as what I am, to lead you out of this age of Antichrist into an age of hope. So with that, you might wonder, with the technology developed to identify the vampire, the Soviets had learned of them through the Slavic mythos. But what was going on during the war? Obviously the 1960s, the decade your mother, Diana, inseminated herself with Adolf Hitler's sperm to be raised by your good father, the combat sailor George Joseph Henry Dietrich. What of the war itself, in which the vampire took part on both sides of the Axis-Allied conflict, exploited by the Soviets as rabid dogs on a leash, united with the National Socialistes in the hopes of acquiring their own nation? How did the Soviets come to even get to this point where they exploited that which they could not identify en masse for extermination until the decade you were born? because of a man, a blood scientist, who was one of the original conspiracy of terrorists with Lenin of Kazan, the pseudonym for Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, his real name, who took on the criminal alias of Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin of Kazan, founded and headed the more hubristic and militant branch of Bolshevism, gathering 21 co-conspirators in St. Petersburg on the Baltic, in his day the capital of all the Russias, Great Russia, White Russia, and the Ukraine. Around the year, oh God, what was it? 1891. And in that year, 1891, 21 terrorists gathered in St. Petersburg with but 12 revolvers among them, announcing among themselves that the score of them would conquer planet Earth. And they proceeded with the relentless intensity of men possessed to establish one of the most brutal tyrannies in the history of the human race, ultimately exporting this form of tyranny not just to regions of the West, but to China and its environs, resulting by time of the forced unification of both Vietnams in 1975 and 1/3 of all humanity attempting to realize the ideological fantasies of the anti-prophet Karl Marx through such semi-ritualized sacrifices as state-organized genocide, state-organized mass starvation, and state-organized mass murder and torture of individuals. The pogroms and aggressions instigated over the course of these regimes has resulted in 1.5 times the number of deaths caused by the proactive prosecution of hostilities on the surface world throughout the Second World War. An extinguished population equivalent to the present populations of the United States and Canada combined, over 300 million plus lives, a veritable superpower itself of the dead. And even after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its East European satellite states, more people today still languish under government equally recognized as single-party communist states than live within multi-party democracies. Now, among the original cadre 22 of Leninist revolutionaries was a certain Dr. Alexander Bodanov, M.D., Medicine Doctor, surname spelled B-O-G-D-A-N-O-V. Dr. Alex Bodanov studied science and psychology in Moscow and Kharkov, received his medical degree in 1899. By that time, he'd also become a Marxist. And, of course, in the years of war and revolution from 1904 to 1907, Vladimir Ulyanov, Mr. Lenin, and Dr. Bodanov were close associates, with Ulyanov, whom the world would know as Lenin, mostly comfortable in Swiss emigration, and Bodanov inside Russia, organizing and directing the underground network of red cells and subversive party organization. So, when these two ultimately came to power, there were needs, demands to write novels outlining the projected workers' utopia. So, in an effort to make the inaccessible Marxist rhetoric more accessible to the hoi polloi, the masses, more appealing to the actual common man, Dr. Bodanov wrote the first official Soviet science fiction novel about the communist conquest of Mars and the establishment of a workers' paradise on the Red Planet. It was first published in 1908. The novel's name was Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, containing chapters with titles such as The Vampire and The Legend of the Vampires. Now, the very term vampire is a Western bastardization of the proto-medieval liturgical Slavonic term vamfiore, amalgamating the ancient Slavic root words of vyom, blood, and fiore, monster. The Eastern Slavic term spread westward into the Balkans, where it was adopted by the Southern Slavs, the Bulgars and the early Yugoslavs, the Serbs and the Hrvatski, the Croatian, and Slovenians. And it received vigorous circulation to identify a threat people couldn't understand. This original name was used in Bodanov's antebellum, or pre-war, pre-translation editions, to imply an aristocracy of beings surviving from the darkest times of prehistory, existing for millennia among mortals, feeding on them in order to ensure the continuity of their own species, generating periodic waves of bestialized feral thralls, perhaps in preparation for a final struggle between the living and the undead. So, this parasitic subspecies with pretensions to station came to symbolize the hated nobility to the communists, the very antithesis of modern mass man's popular utopianism, but an inseparable facet of the primitive Russian psyche. So, when it comes to Bodanov and his study of the vampire in Soviet times, how did that become somehow applicable to a scientific investigation? Well, what happened, of course, was the overthrow of the Tsar, and then what you had was the establishment under the communists, the Bolsheviks, of mass collectivization. And under this kleptocracy, this government by thieves, so similar to Putinista Russia today, you had the urbanization, which the Russians are no longer engaged in. Their cities are dying. They're industrial wastelands, because no one is industrializing in Russia today. It's a post-industrial state in the most negative sense, not progressing towards an information-based technology or a service technology or economy in either sense, but only a carcass, an undead state, rapidly polluting the blood and spirit of all other nation-states on earth today. This undead empire, at the time of the Soviet Union, was thriving in the sense of industrialization, undergoing an industrial revolution, moving all of its population off the farms and into the cities, collectivizing the agriculture, resulting in mass famine, intentionally to starve out nationalities like the Ukrainians, who resist the Russians to this day, and the Russians hate them for it, and so do you, because your Russian propaganda has convinced you the Ukrainians are the threat, and the Russians are your master race. In that period of time in which Ukraine was being starved to death, the bicameral body of government instituted by the 1936 Constitution, comprising the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities, it was during this period of time, 1936, that one of Dr. Bodanov's major concerns became blood transfusion, a technique that had become popular in World War I, where the procedure was still Russian roulette, to use upon a crapshoot, as blood typing did not yet exist. To Bodanov, blood transfusion acquired almost metaphysical overtones. It was a way to rejuvenate the exhausted human organism. It was a symbol of the future of collectivized medicine in which the proletariat would replace each other's body parts routinely They would become one biological mass, with everyone sharing each other's organs. Towards this ultimate objective, Dr. Bodanov founded the Institute for Blood Transfusion in 1926 and devoted himself to a series of experiments aimed at improving the technique as a way to realize his dream, first described in his science fiction novel Red Star, which circulated in hundreds of thousands of copies in the 1920s, of enabling the comradely exchange of life, where people would literally give their lives to others and receive other people's lives in turn. A true collectivized communism, not just of the society, but the body politic becoming one single unified body politic, one living organism, a collectivist entity. And towards this mad vision, Dr. Bodanov would eventually give his own life in this cause, so characteristic of the utopian experiments generated by the revolution. While he was combating and containing outbreaks of ARP, agenital rabid porphyria, a normally rare but serious condition that very likely prompted mass vampire syndrome during the Middle Ages, in olden days recognized as the Nosferatu tumor, the Nosferatu contagion. Now, 7 separate enzymatic deficiency disorders fall under the category of porphyria, an abnormality of the hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein. These extremely rare metabolic diseases are caused by a deficiency in the enzyme needed for synthesis of MA proteins functioning as oxygen carriers during respiration. The absence of this enzyme sends part of the blood pigment, hemoglobin, to the urine rather than to the cells, to be processed out as a toxin. The term porphyria derives from the Greek word for purple, as purple or pink urine is one of the common characteristics, the liquid turning dark red after standing in light. Under ultraviolet light, it glows in the dark. It turns fluorescent. This symptom is useful in convincing physicians that a serious medical problem is present, as many doctors fail to diagnose the disease, oft preferring to assume a psychological cause like VPD or vampiric personality disorder. Now, this be understandable, but not excusable, because porphyrins accumulate to toxic levels and attack the nervous system. Patients can't sleep and may become irritable, restless, psychotic, confused, all suffer from severe photosensitivity, causing those afflicted with the disease to shun sunlight. Some of the ailing display skin symptoms, such as a lack of pigmentation and blistering in direct sunlight. Nails and skin may fluoresce or glow in the dark. Chemical imbalances manifest blotchy discoloration of the skin, scarring, and an accelerated growth of hair, along with infections that damage facial features and fingers, leading to elongated teeth and even fangs. Sometimes a reddening of the teeth occurs. Forms of the disease may vary, but the severe ones make people handicapped with this disease appear like the undead, with their paleness, thickening hairness, skin ulcerating in the sun, fingers falling off, and an aversion to garlic. Now, they supposedly could take to drinking fresh blood in a desperate effort to alleviate their suffering from these terrible symptoms by introducing the required elements, the HEME, the HEME, into their systems. It's a physiological axiom that whatever your body needs will taste good. I knew personally of people who had survived the fire bombings of World War II, and of course because they were malnourished and so lacking in various oxidants through any normal diet, that when they had cod liver oil kept around as medicinal in the primitive days of apothecary, they could spread that on their bread, and it tasted so sweet it was like honey to them. That's the symptom of your deprived body interpreting that which your body needs with a sweet taste. But voluminous ingestion of human blood provokes vomiting. And the oral intake of amounts far less than a pint get broken down in the stomach into amino acids, iron, and proteins. Yet still, most of it would be rejected by a baseline physiology. However, in a person with porphyria, Their biology is no longer baseline. They need that blood. And to this day, human blood cannot be truly manufactured, and animal blood cannot normally replace it. I can go into that tangent another time, but you normally cannot use pig blood to replace human blood, even though you can use pig valves, porcine valves, to replace human heart valves. So when it comes to blood, people are the only really practical source of human blood. Certainly so, until the Second World War and synthetic blood development by Japanese biological warfare units. Now you might wonder how the Japanese came on the secret of developing synthetic blood. You can look this up, don't take my word for it. Synthetic blood was developed in World War II by Japanese biological warfare units under direct direction of Emperor Hirohito, so they didn't need blood drives. They could make their own. That was one of my late and sainted mother's father's direct donations to the war effort. The study of his vampire blood enabled Emperor Hirohito to have an endless supply of synthetic blood for his soldiers as they waged World War II. For that alone, he was allowed to marry a Japanese woman of noble descent to produce my own mother, the fortnight lover of Adolf Hitler. Now, even today, treatment of porphyria requires heme injection. Arcing back to medieval practices, bleeding porphyriacs via leaching diminished the body's content of iron, a practice since vindicated by its reemergence in World War II Germany under Heinrich Himmler of the Schutzstaffel. But porphyrias tend to be congenital, genetically transmitted. They're not supposed to assume epidemiological nature. They can't become plagues. But viruses can. And typically most viruses are species-specific and confined to one genus. Otherwise, everything on Earth would be infected with what everything else on Earth has. Those that cross species barriers and transmit to man are referred to as zoonotic viruses. Zoonotic viruses cause the most morbidity and mortality. The bacterium Yersinia pestis was transmitted to man by fleas of rodents, carrying the plagues of the Middle Ages that decimated Europe. Of course, these weren't from the rat. The rat is innocent. They were from a Japanese, ultimately Asian, a Pan-Asian species of rodent deployed by the Mongols ahead of their invasions to weaken the populations of their enemies, which included the Japanese as enemies of the Mongols. So the Mongols were able to use the Asian gerbil as the carrier of the Black Plague and weaken, with the genocide of 100 million peoples, the populations of all Eurasia outside of isolated Japan, safe from the plague, being an island nation that the Mongols could never invade, protected as Japan was by the divine wind and the tsunamis, and their immunity to the Black Plague via clinical isolation of their entire body politic, with their barrier to the plagues being the sea itself. And so the Mongols, spreading the use of rabies, rather, the use of their biological weapon, the Yersinia pestis, infected the Europeans, the Southwest Asians of the Muslim empires of the Caliphate, which never recovered. The Mongols took it all down by biological warfare using their specially bred Asian gerbils as their vanguard weapon. And that, of course, brings to my mind rabies. When the Mongols did what they did, these plagues became affiliated with vampirism. When Vladislav Dracula's greatest publicist, the Irish house nigger Bram Stoker, propagandized against him as a supervillain in his novel Dracula, Vladislav Sepish as Nosferatu Rex, or King of the Undead, is portrayed as having a massive control over rats, the ability to deploy rats as a vanguard weapon to weaken his enemies prior to his strike. This was based on the medieval European experience with the Mongol hordes. But the rabies, it becomes a part of this narrative, the decisive factor. Because rabies is another primarily animal virus that accidentally infects humans as a neurological disorder. Historically, there was a large rabies epidemic that spread throughout Eastern Europe, especially Viktor Orban's Hungary, which was then the Kingdom of Majarzak, which at that point in history included Carpathia, Transylvania, and parts of modern Romania. During the early part of the 18th century is when this rabies epidemic scoured the European subcontinent. Now, shortly after this epidemic of biting and various aversions, reports of vampires began to surface during the early 1730s. Wolves and dogs, animals associated with vampires, are common carriers of rabies. So when Eastern European peasants observed the behaviors of rabid wolves and rabid humans, they concluded that vampires were present. Dogs infuriated by rabies, they go around snapping at everything and everybody, biting everything in sight. They will eat anything. They will eat straw. They will eat anybody. Now, rabies-infected humans are hypersensitive to sunlight, manifesting psychophysical fear of the sun. It's called heliophobia. They shun light. That's photophobia. And they don't like to see themselves in mirrors. That's spectrophobia. Those afflicted with rabies have aversion to strong odors. It is the smell of garlic. And, of course, garlic being this poignant, stinking rose, it was interpreted to be a ward to the vampires. Now, this turned out, of course, to be quite true under Soviet studies, for reasons that are, of course, part of the subspeciation. But rabies victims are not a subspecies. Rabies victims suffer insomnia and increased sex drive. They experience enormous thirst and have trouble swallowing, and sometimes bloody saliva drips from their mouths as they froth constantly in this frothing due to muscle spasms that cause bared teeth. So rabies sufferers can engage in ferocious, aggressive behavior with the tendency to bite and infect others and rape them. And through the bodily fluids or the saliva, transmit the virus through the biting or the raping. But this isn't subspeciation. This is disease. And the symptoms of this disease, of rabies, has about 3 stages. The first stage is a tingling sensation and soreness, a loss of appetite, restlessness, sleeplessness, melancholia, irritability. This lasts about 48 hours. Stage 2 is one of general excitement, furious spasms, difficult breathing and convulsions, and in due course, a generalized fear of water, hydrophobia. The sound of someone even speaking about water causes a contraction of the larynx and the victim can't breathe. The sight of water be equally effective. Then the paralleling of rabid dog gnashing becomes apparent. This isn't necessarily a nervous factor. Humans won't try to bite ordinarily unless they've lost all sense of rationality. Quite simply, a form of insanity sets in by second stage. The senses are so heightened that the rabid might try to eat their pillows. And, of course, the old legends are that vampires can't cross running water. That's the hydrophobia. Now, this isn't true vampirism. This is rabies. And the challenge for Dr. Bodanov was in trying to find the carrier. By stage 3 of ARP, agenital rabid porphyria, specifically, the infected individual, the hypersexual porphyriac, walks the night with pallid, fluorescent skin and nail, red fangs bared, and frothing bloody fluid at the mouth, spasming and snapping his or her jaws shut convulsively, stalking victims to rape and or desanguinate, drink blood from, yet repelled by garlic, unable to look in mirrors, and afraid to cross water. The syndrome be eventually terminal in effect, the unrelenting spasmosis of musculature producing systemic lactic acid buildup that leads to severe abdominal pain and constipation. This ultimately weakens the rabid infectee and forces them into a stupor, at which point sanitary necessity in underdeveloped environments like medieval Europe and post-revolutionary Russia, the Soviet Union of the 1930s, demanded immediate burial. Many such prematurely interred individuals would inevitably recover buried alive. And the very nature of the disease oft inspired public exhumations in impacted regions, and another symptom of vampirism frequently mentioned in the old accounts was that vampiric cadavers had ravenous appetites which caused them to eat their own burial shrouds, the linings of their coffins, and sometimes even their own fingertips. Even today, bodies are still exhumed to assess the dormant bacilli or viral proteins of plagues under study. More recently, such disinterments were conducted in the northern polar regions of Alaska to revivify the avian swine flu virus, the army avian swine flu, the H1N1, all developed by the United States Army to genocidally impact human evolution by the Neuromodes 1 virus, the so-called Spanish flu, produced in the United States, using American troops as intentional vectors that rendered Europe incapable of carrying out World War I. That caused the German victory on the East, their triumph over Tsarist Russia, to turn into defeat with the elimination of a goodly portion of their population that led to the fascists and the National Socialistes, the Nazis, revitalizing, resuscitating, reanimating the Adlocutio, the Roman legionnaire salute, what Americans call the Heil Hitler, so that people would stop shaking hands and transmitting diseases like the American Army flu. That's why the Asians bow, and always have, because all flus are avian flus, all flus are swine flus, and all flus are Asian flus. So the Asian population does its best to prevent them by bowing instead of clasping hands. The fascists took on this tradition and conducted the Roman Adlocutio as a greeting and as a closure of bargaining processes, all based on the American weaponization of Asian avian swine flu into the American Army flu, the only flu in the world ever named after another source than an Asian source, the so-called Spanish flu, named such because the American forces disembarked in Spain, a nominally neutral country, to invade Europe in World War I. And, of course, they arrived in what the Spanish themselves called coffin ships. The overwhelming majority of American troops are already dead of the flu weaponized and incepted in the cantons of the United States, these military cantons, in which men were forced to sleep side by side, leading to the greatest genocide in all human history perpetrated under Woodrow Wilson as executive commander-in-chief of these United States. But that story, I've gone on at length about before. I can go on at length about it again. Right now, we need to concentrate on what time we have left, what time my executive producer can stand. We need to concentrate on the subject of Russian rabies. Russian rabies, as it appeared in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, was apparently a long-dormant surviving strain, opportunistically revitalized by the unprecedented urbanization concomitant with the fetish of industrialism so integral to the communist state and its mobilization for total war to enforce the dictatorship of the proletariat on all mankind. The overcrowding induced by forced relocations tended to turn peasant into factory worker, led to flashpoints of rabid humans attacking fellow laborers with intent to ravish and sanguinoidal, to bleed, betraying this strain as inducing acute intermittent porphyria, AIP, agenetically, without heritage or bloodline, in a form more serious than any congenital porphyrias known to medicine. So Dr. Bodanov, the blood specialist, the plasma physiologist of the Soviet Union, interpreted the re-emergent Nosferatu contagion as a mutation of ambulant bubonic plague, a mild form of the Black Death marked by mild fever and tissue swelling. Testamentally, there have been repeated clinical correlations between outbreaks of plague and outbreaks of what's been interpreted to be vampirism. There was no reason why a disease which may have been prevalent in medieval Europe was no longer known in modern medicine. Dr. Bodanov theorized that the Black Death, which hit Europe around the 15th century, contemporaneous with the reign of the historical Dietrich, the son of the dragon, Vladislav Dracula. Dracula, his knighted title, his name being Vladislav Sepish. It might have been around for centuries without causing any harm whatsoever since that time, but something had changed in the organism. A mutation arose somewhere along the line that was being transmitted in a highly pathogenic form without an identifiable zoonotic vector that could cause endless deaths. This had probably been a chronic, low-level phenomena throughout the history of Tsarist Russia, kept quiescent by general underdevelopment and isolation of communities that Tsars and their medievalist economy entailed. Now, equally, in Bodanov's eyes, a civilization might have been hit by a tremendously virulent organism. This organism could have changed so that there was no sign of it today. Thus, it was quite possible that vampirism, or lycanthropy, the werewolf syndrome, Lykos is Greek for wolf, lycorexia meaning a craving for raw meat. Per Roman mythology, Jupiter, Jove, king of the classical Hellenic gods, transmogrified the cruel, cannibalistic King Lycaon of Arcadia. King Lycaon was transmogrified into a mutation, a creature, an entity known as Adolphios, transliterally Wolf King, the sire of all werewolves. It's from that name we get the shortening, the diminutive, Adolph. Adolf means Wolf King. That was the name granted to Adolf Hitler. Now this mass lycanthropy, per Dr. Bodanov's Sovietic paradigm, could have been associated with, but not caused by, some disease that disappeared completely from modern civilization. It could have been the common cold or influenza, which have since changed their form. But in those days it might have been a plague that could wipe out a civilization, exemplary of the manner in which measles had devastated the Fijians, the islanders of the Pacific, when introduced by white colonists. But for most diseases, there be a subgroup of individuals who appear immune to its effects. Bodanov remained asymptomatic, without symptoms, though suffering repeatedly from biting in his chronic exposure to vampiroid humans, in an ongoing hit-and-run battle to isolate the outbreaks of rabid porphyria throughout the Soviet Union of the 1930s. He ultimately realized why he was immune, whereas anyone else who was bitten by these same individuals would ultimately die in that state that the individuals biting them were in. He was immune because, when he served his internship in the 1890s, Dr. Bodanov had circuited the Black Sea and then the Pripyat marshes of Ukraine, during which time he was bitten in his sleep by a bat. Now this incident alone was justification for major medical investigation, as there be no blood-sucking bats in Europe. The vampire bat be a creature of the New World, unknown in Europe until the age of discovery. Old World bats rest also by day and prowl by night, but they eat only of fruit and insects. The totemic flying icon of the European vampire has always been the Vrioskodlak, bastardized in name and definition as Vukodlak, the huge black mutated Voron, the raven, which took to carrion scavenging the battlefields of Europe's interminable wars and the open mass graves of the continent's recurring plagues, gorging on the remains of human flesh until they could tolerate no other sustenance, at which stage they would take to swooping infants out of their cribs in the night. In bad times, entire flocks of these terrible birds are known to swarm over unlucky villages. At some point, it is believed, many of these demoniacal ravens become undead creatures themselves, their shambling, animated flying carcasses answering to the call of true vampiri, vampires, to mass murder their enemies. And like true vampires, they cannot bear the light of day, but are not destroyed by it. Now, in the case of Bodanov's bat bite, it was eventually realized that the fact that Florida bats could carry rabies made it a distinct possibility that a bat in Europe might become a carrier under an extraordinary series of circumstantial flukes. Any rabid animal will bite anything in its path, not for food, but because it suffers violent muscular contractions. Dr. Bodanov's colleagues speculated that the bat which bit him had somehow singularly acquired the vampire microbe previous to encountering Bodanov. By the time said microbe entered Bodanov's bloodstream, it must have been strained and weakened by the bat's immunosystem. As a result, Bodanov had been vaccinated organically and had immunity to the Nosferatu contagion. Some bacilli are weakened when they pass from body to body, since each host's immune system alters it somewhat, making it ever less infectious. Bodanov's immunosystem, both his human antibodies and cellular interactions, acted in such a way that they were able to recognize and destroy the ambulant bubonic vampire plague, the ABVP bacilli, or germs. Now, the best defense to infectious diseases be the human immunosystem. Bodanov's circulating tissue, his liquid organ, his own blood, was obviously the key to preventing rabid porphyria from posing serious consequences to the ultimate survival of the Russian state, perhaps to humanity itself. With past as prelude, the Nosferatu contagion was a bacterial time bomb. But now the question was the culprit species. The black marsh bat was mammalian, as are humans, expediting infection. But the encounter event had been singular. The plague that was ravaging the Soviet Union under Stalin's early days, forcing him to render the Soviet Union into an early version of North Korea, a hermit state, but covering, instead of a peninsula or a half a peninsula, the entire greater body of the Eurasian landmass. This plague appeared to be human-specific, since any dogs recovered in the various hot zones, off simply impacted factory blocks with resident labor facilities in the Soviet Union, seemed perfectly fine, and therefore immune to both microbial vampirism and immune to blame as its carrier. Now, the bacillus itself obviously wasn't airborne or vampire victory, so to speak, would already have been self-evident throughout the Soviet Union of the 1930s. Nor could the disease be vectored by agents that could easily travel through the air, such as mosquitoes, flies, ticks, mites, or fleas. If any of these vectors effectively carried the pathogen, the ongoing Russian Revolution would have been a very different shade of red, a great de-evolution into anarchy. An almost inconceivable prospect, considering that more Russians perished in the First and Second Russian Revolutionary Civil Wars than in the Third Russian Civil War, comprising World War II's Eastern Front. 33 million were lost in the Russian versus Russian anti-monarchist, anti-Menshevik struggles, compared to 27 million lost against the Axis in the World War II uprising of anti-Soviet nationalities. Now, these fatality rates are always much higher in internecine than in international conflicts. Civil wars are the cruelest wars by definition. Neither side recognizes the legitimacy of the other. There be no honorable adversaries, only traitors. By definition, the fighting takes place on home territory, and by definition, friend and foe are difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish. The First and Second Russian Civil Wars, however, occupy a lower dimension of brooding Slavic horror, tragedy, and despair. And yet, out of them was produced the fact that vampires exist, the concept of a carrier for rabid porphyria. It follows war. It's the horseman that follows the other. So plague was carried on the back of those Russian civil wars. Forced collectivization. Urbanization. Furthermore, the bacilli carrying this plague could not reasonably be carried by mechanical means, such as on the clothes, skin, or other objects that are readily carried or transported. If such were the case, D-Day would have been necessitated almost 2 decades earlier, not as an invasion, but as a continental blockade and quarantine. Rather, evidently, these viral outbreaks of porphyromania required human-to-human contact to spread. One need look no further than the AIDS epidemics throughout the world of the 1980s and 90s to realize the implications that I present in this historical narrative. The human immunodeficiency virus, the HIV, is still to this day decimating much of sub-Saharan Africa in spite of worldwide efforts to combat it. Now, come the early 1960s, adulating Western commentators would generally preach that Russia was destined to inevitably assume its rightful position as the leading world power, with Moscow as the center of the universe, ignoring the hard reality that Russia was, and still is today, nothing other than a third world nation in every respect. Now, come the 1970s, the United States would recognize Russia as an equal nuclear power. Only a small cadre of Soviet emigres not employing themselves as professional defectors vocalized even at the pinnacle of Soviet empire in 1979 that the USSR was an upper volta with rockets, only to be studiously ignored in turn by think tank Sovietologists whose entire careers and incomes were based on Soviet threat inflation to justify Pentagon budgets before American congressional committees. Now, geologically, the world's unacknowledged eighth continent of Eurasiberia, or cartographically North Asia, what we know today as Russia, neither truly European nor truly Asian. The Soviet Union, asprawl this Inner Asian or Central Asian heartland, from whence all the planetary surface's populated continents have drifted, has held itself apart, paranoid of all things outside its borders, yet keen to make itself the socio-evolutionary vanguard for the rest of the world. The germ or viral protein confronting Bogdanov and his colleagues could easily have aborted the nascent Soviet colossus and turned Russian Eurasia into the dark continent of the Northern Hemisphere, a porphyrial miasma to rival Africa's pervasive malaria and prohibiting development. All viruses and other infectious diseases need a host as a carrier. The staff of the Blood Transfusion Institute filtered this reality through the ideological lens of medical socialism and strict adherence to atheistic evolutionary doctrine, implying primate culpability. For some viruses, monkeys, particularly the African green monkey, are very suitable carriers. One disastrous outbreak, decades into the future from the Soviet standpoint at that time, at Marburg University in Germany in the 80s, I believe, resulted in a case of highly fatal hemorrhagic fever among handlers of and laboratory workers involved with green monkeys. The disease itself was named Marburg after this incident. It's mistakes like this that demonstrate the seriousness of these viruses. Now, a carrier be any person or animal that literally carries a specific infectious agent in the absence of any visible clinical disease, and serves as a potential source of infection unto others. One example of a famous carrier many may be familiar with is Mary Milan, also known as Typhoid Mary historically, an immigrant Irish woman who spread typhoid fever through her professional cooking during her 38-year career. She definitely had typhoid, but presented no symptoms herself of the fever whatsoever. Yet wherever she traveled, she infected those around her with exposure to the typhoid bacillus, ultimately killing enough victims to help inspire Stephen King's novel, The Stand. Now, in 1927, before the outbreak of rabid porphyria in the Soviet Union, after some horrifying false starts in hybridizing killer chimeric half-ape, half-men,
the short-lived results of which were tolerated as collateral research byproducts of the Supreme Soviet only because the USSR was now locked in an intense covert genetic race with the still capitalist, pre-democratic Roosevelt Socialist administration. United States to create subhumanic trans-species, both world powers of the United States and the Soviet Union motivated by diametrically opposed economic rationales toward supplanting the majority of their populations. And both the United States and the Soviet Union earning ultimate National Socialist or Nazi ideological enmity by their cultural commitment to interspecial downbreeding. In this environment of the gene race, the race to the bottom, the race to downbreed a subhuman species of laborer that would literally work for peanuts, a man named Bobby Yerkes, surname spelled Y-E-R-K-E-S, in the United States, was forcing abducted human woman in Cuba, abducted Cuban human woman, what he derisively termed Cumans. He forced them, strapped to tables, to suffer the rape of monkeys he had imported out of Africa to breed capitalist labor for American corporations so they could do away with all human labor because of the phenomenon of unionism in the United States. His hybrid sons roam the swamps today. The people in Dixie call them skunk monkeys. In the Soviet Union, a mad geneticist named Ivan Ilyich Ivanov decided expedition to Africa would help him attain his stated objectives. He appealed to Stalin and received approval from the Soviet government. He was provided financial support in the amount of $291,912 in hard United States currency equivalent to $1 million. By today's currency standards, that would be $1 billion. In a third world nation suffering from mass famine, this son of a bitch was given $1 billion in black budget to bring monkeys back to the Soviet Union so they could strap human woman to the table and let the monkeys go at it so they could squeeze out hybrid children. Now Ivanov had already proved his ability to hybridize animals in the past. He was known worldwide as a hybrid geneticist. He was someone who it was known could make the impossible happen. And because he had done this to create exotic animals for animal labor and for weaponization in war for his emperor, the Tsar, he survived the Tsarist revolution to be taken on by Joseph Stalin in his desire to create a race to replace the Russians, a race of apes, to ultimately provide a slave race to Joseph Stalin as a Caucasian white that he found less repulsive than the Slavic peoples of Russia he ruled over, who he considered an Asian subhuman species to be annihilated as cannon fodder in his wars and ultimately replaced by their hybridized primatoid successors in a backwards evolution to take humanity not back to the Stone Age, but to the treetops, the utopia of devouring fruit in our arboreal Eden, to be carried by the communists worldwide via reforestation of the world through a runaway greenhouse effect that Vladimir Putin is carrying out today. Then, when enough of our environment is tropical, does Vladimir Putin intend to unleash the hybridized race of primates reservation in the Sakha region of Russia, Russia's Congo, from whence they derive their diamond mining. And it's there that the hybrid race of half-apes be employed underground in slavery to this day, awaiting their orders, no longer from a Soviet state, but now by a man who fancies himself the Antichrist, Vladimir Putin, to unleash themselves on the world. The children of Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, the geneticist of total amorality, who by 1898 had established several zoological laboratories in Moscow, where he studied the reproductive processes of farm animals in order to investigate heterosis, hybrid vigor, the concept that the vigor of hybrids is greater than that of the parental lines, perhaps validated as manifest in myself. By 1901, Ivanov had established the world's first center for the artificial insemination of racehorses. He used this facility and its artificially impregnated horses to produce interspecies hybrids, successfully creating a Z-donk, a zebra donkey, an incredible feat, as there are far more genetic differences between zebras and horses than between humans and gorillas. He also created a Zubran, a European bison, hybridized with a domestic cow, and various other crosses that vindicated the theory that heterosis levels tend to be higher as a result of crossbreeding. Hybrid vigor rules. Even before the Leninist revolution, he was interested in the possibilities of using similar practical techniques as applied to other domesticated species to produce ape-human hybrids. In 1910, he delivered a presentation in Graz, Austria, to the World Congress of Zoologists, describing exactly such a scheme. One of the men who read of this and found himself aghast was a man who found a record of it in the library named Adolf Hitler. And he realized he would dedicate his life to breeding pure-blooded Aryan peoples instead of a denigration that would take evolution back to the age of the treetops. And meanwhile, Ivanov exploited his fame, rightly earned from preserving endangered species for Tsarist country, using artificial insemination to entrance Stalin with the idea that hybridization between apes and humans held the potential of breeding for the Red Army a new race, who would be both uncomplaining workers and super-strong ratnik warriors, unafraid of death and undone by any sense of human empathy. A living war machine, as the ideal was described before the Politburo. And hence, he got his money from Stalin, and hence was born the penultimate ideological enmity between Bolshevik communism and National Socialism. The Russian and International Reds rejected textual Marxist racialism, which Hitler incorporated, for Engelian revisionism, and took the stance of genic hybridization to close the ring of evolution full circle between Homo sapiens sapiens and Pan troglodytes. While the NSDAP, the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiter Party, the National Socialist Germanic Workers' Party upheld the torch of genic purification to elevate the Nordic ethnos to an Aryan ideal. Stalin's insult of racial-specific deportations out of the former order of the German Knights, the Teutonic Order of the Baltic littoral nations of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, peoples as Germanic as the peoples of Central Europe themselves. His deportation of them in 1941 was to prove the spark that ignited German armed response in the form of Operation Barbarossa, But Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was also launched for another reason. Because, of course, the Soviets were producing a man-ape in Siberia that the German imperialists realized would be used as a vanguard to overrun the world, not only as combatants themselves, but as carriers of the plague which was now taking the Soviet Union down. And all the world faced the concept, the prospect of humans becoming the carriers of the rabies, this rabid porphyria, which even Bodanov himself in the Soviet Union assumed must be from the rape of human women by apes. So, Bodanov began to investigate the Homo descendant, the broodworker program, not of Robert Yerkes, the man in the United States, but that of Dr. Ivanov in the Soviet Union. Because Robert Yerkes in the United States was forcing the rape of Cuban women on an island nation in Cuba. Both the hybrids and the diseases they might have transmitted were originally isolated. It was only with the release of his hybrids into the wild that the skunk ape phenomena began to appear and haunt the Dixieland swamps until today. Whereas in Russia, Stalin's his aggressive investment in Ivanov's Novi Cro-Magenitor, the new Cro-Magnon progenitor program, betrayed an urgency to usher in a post-human age of degenerate superspeciation that was considered as vital to the Soviet regime as pioneering the dawn of the space age. Stalin's initial military fixation regarding the Cro-Mags was forcibly broadened to gestation of an inhuman industrial army envisioned as the largest branch of Soviet armed services, all of which were to be reorganized under command economy. Thus it was that the USSR would no longer possess a military-industrial complex. It became a military-industrial complex. Sans civilian economic ephemera completely. And as the core of this was the idea of Stalin's industrial army, a non-human force to overwhelm the human labor forces deployed by world capital on the vast new front of mass productivity. And the pressure was on because Bobby Yerkes in Florida, traveling back and forth between Florida and Cuba with his abducted Cuban victims, promised American industrial interests mass delivery of a subhuman, wageless labor force, and his biolaboratory assets, having been moved offshore to circumnavigate working-class outrage over their anticipated replacement as a species, and any potential sabotage efforts that could be expected in desperate campaigns to frustrate this eventuality. All of his bioprototypes, delivered from the wombs of involuntary Cuban broodmares. All of this haunts us today below the Mason-Dixon line, that geographic scar of shame that crosses America, dividing the non-slave states from the chattel slavery of the Deep South. All of this was nothing compared to Ivanov. He posted at the zoological gardens in Conakry, in Africa. He got his chimps, and he brought them back to the Soviet Union under direction of Levente Beria, of the NKVD, the forerunner to the KGB, and proceeded to get Russian female volunteers in the name of post-human communism to subject themselves to primate sex. Now, Dr. Bodanov, the transfusion expert, the blood physiologist, he was convinced that this was the source of the contemporary raging plague of vampire psychosis. And yet, investigations failed to produce a vampire gorilla from Dr. Ivanov's labs in Soviet Georgia. In that nation-state of Georgia was where women were forced to have sex with monkeys, or rather volunteered to do so under Soviet indoctrination. But it was only with Kirlian photography in the 1960s they were able to isolate all citizens of the Soviet Union who were vampiroid and annihilate them in the detonation of Tsar Bomba in the most efficient one-point genocide ever conducted in recorded human history. There are no vampires today in motherfucking Russia. But a survivor of their species transmits to you now on the digital bandwidth, that you may know we can exist and coexist in peace and prosperity as was intended by my father Adolf Hitler, who had offered a nation of their own to the vampires who fought for the Reich. He himself sought the transfusions of the blood. And that's why his doctor, on record accessible to all people today, wrote that after the Bulgarian treatment, Adolf Hitler's blood was changing to the point where the urine he produced was beer brown, as Adolf Hitler himself began to vampirize before he evacuated the surface world for Unterland. And so it is today that he likely still be alive, his life extended by the very genes that have helped to resuscitate my own youthful appearance via my return to a semi-regular consumption of human blood. So I'll bring this transmission to an end for tonight. I hope it's provided some level of epiphany to all of our listeners. My love unto all that support me. My thanks for your patience with the time it takes for my narratives to present you some context for the realities of history that you've never been exposed to. And I pray that this understanding will help you rally behind myself towards working towards a better world and a brighter future.